Hey, greetings. By way of introduction, my name is Livingston. I frequently go by Don. I'm the senior UX developer at Fashionphile. And today I'm going to be talking on K.I.S.sing Webpack, the acronym K.I.S.S., usually standing for Keep It Simple Stupid, but I call it Keep It Simple and Sublime because I didn't wish to imply anyone working with Webpack is stupid, though anyone familiar with Webpack documentation has probably felt that way at some point. I'm going to start with a little background about how we got to where we are in the world of web development. Many of you will probably be familiar with this, but I'm just going to lay some groundwork. I'm going to start with a little quote from one of my favorite authors, Douglas Adams. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. Setting the Wayback Machine to the year 1993, the Mosaic web browser was released. And while it wasn't the first web browser, it was certainly the first to launch the World Wide Web into popular awareness. This coincided with the publication of the first proposal for the HTML specification by Tim Berners-Lee and Dan Connolly. After a few years and a few web browser evolutions, Netscape Navigator became the successor to Mosaic, and in 1995, Netscape version 2.0 was released with a prototype scripting language initially called LiveScript, but was quickly rebranded JavaScript, because at the time, Java was the hot new programming language, and Netscape wanted to tie into that, even though JavaScript had as much to do with Java as hamburger has to do with ham. Then, not wanting to be left out, Microsoft created their own version of JavaScript called JScript, which was just the next escalation in the first browser wars. Microsoft and Netscape went back and forth for years implementing new features, trying to become the dominant portal for delivering web content. The trouble was that using these features meant that a web developer had to code with a specific browser in mind. This resulted in the rather embarrassing label, "This site best viewed with," that was an all too frequent occurrence. Other technologies came and went. Shockwave and Flash both had their days in the sun, for example. And for a long time, JavaScript was a fill-in-the-gaps tool for people who weren't up to programming using a quote-unquote real programming language. Eventually, things started to settle down a bit, and web developers started to agree that web pages based on open standards was the sanest path forward. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript each became standardized, and browsers each started rendering web pages more or less according to those standards. And thus came forth the holy trinity of web development. HTML handled the structure of a page, JavaScript provided the behavior, and CSS provided instructions for how the page needed to look. And this setup was a solid foundation for publishing web pages, and importantly, it had a low barrier to entry. Anyone with a text editor and some time could create a serviceable website that would look and behave the same on whatever browser it was viewed on. And all was right with the World Wide Web. Of course, it was never quite that simple, but that's the way things were trying to be. Even though HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have standardized, that hasn't stopped them from continuing to evolve. Templating languages and frameworks have appeared to help speed up the development of large-scale websites. Libraries were introduced that provided new features or provided a bridge to features not yet implemented. And compilers, preprocessors, post-processors, polyfills, and so on have been developed and continue to be developed in what seems to be a never-ending parade. Soon enough, a number of other tools came out with the aim at managing the increasing complexity of web development. Task runners such as Grunt and Gulp helped with the process of compiling, processing, and minifying. Package managers helped with pulling in the libraries and frameworks that are now a ubiquitous part of every web application. And module bundlers came around to help sort through the often tedious process of deciding what libraries are needed on what page. Which brings me around to Webpack. So there are a few reasons why I picked Webpack as a topic of discussion. The first reason, it is currently everywhere. All three of the top JavaScript frameworks, Angular, React, and Vue, use it as their default bundling and build tool. Secondly, as JavaScript technologies go, it's a fairly mature and robust technology, and it's unlikely to disappear anytime soon. And thirdly, I'll be honest, it's a beast. If any of you have spun up a project using the CLI tools for Angular, React, or Vue, and have taken a look at their Webpack config files that they produce, you're aware how frustratingly complex and nigh impenetrable it can be. And so if it's such a beast, why do I have the audacity to subtitle my talk, Keep It Simple, Stupid? Or Keep It Stupidly Simple, or Keep It Simple and Sublime. I'll be honest, it's not because I'm in any way an expert, either in Webpack or simplicity. All I really wanted to do was wrestle and dig in with Webpack for a little while, and creating a presentation on that topic seemed like a good idea and a good way to learn it. I'm taking my cue from some of the other earlier talks on how if you really want to learn something, you have to teach it. I've seen a couple of variations of this quote, but this is one I really like. It's by a philosopher by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. It said, "The only simplicity to be trusted is the simplicity to be found on the far side of complexity." I mentioned earlier that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have a very low barrier to entry. They're very easy to learn and pick up the basics. But anyone who has worked with them for any length of time understands that simplicity fades rather quickly. And we cannot get to the simplicity on the far side of complexity without first tackling and trying to understand that complexity. Webpack is a very complex toolkit for managing complexity. And with a little study and effort, Webpack can maybe help us get to that far side. One question you also might be asking is, do I really need it? Now, if all you're doing is working with basic HTML and CSS, and you only have 1 or 2 JavaScript files to serve to a client, then Webpack is going to be like fitting a rocket engine to a bicycle. It's a lot of upfront work for what will likely be a very short trip. However, as I said, you can only go so far with just the basics. If you want to master your craft, you have to wrestle with complexity sooner or later. So I'm going to start off by making some silly assumptions that you are all already somewhat familiar with working in the command line and have Node.js installed, and by extension, the Node package manager. Other package managers, Yarn for instance, are available and perfectly serviceable. But as I said at the outset, I'm trying to keep it simple. Additionally, I'm going to excuse myself from giving a live coding demo. I consider myself a reasonably competent public speaker and a pretty good coder, but my efforts at synthesizing those 2 skills have not gone well. Now, there may be some of you who have never built a project up from scratch, or if you've up to this point relied on the excellent CLI tools provided by one of the major frameworks to get you running, then here's some basics to get underway. Start by creating a project folder and going into it in your command line /console/terminal, and initialize the project by typing in npm init-y. Next, we will install Webpack and the Webpack CLI using npm, and then install some JavaScript libraries for us to work with. Here, for example, I've installed the Babel loader, which Webpack uses, CSS and style loaders, a Webpack HTML Webpack plugin, and I've also, just for the heck of it, thrown in the Moment library, just for show and tell, basically. Now, Webpack doesn't require any configuration, strictly speaking, but it is possible, and it is possible to do a fair amount direct from the command line. Nevertheless, it's easier to keep track of what's going on by creating a config file. Here I'm going to create just the webpack.config.js. And next we'll create an entry point for Webpack to work from, which is going to be in the source folder and index.js. All right, looking at our little project here so far, we've got a node modules folder, a source folder with the index.js entry point, a package.json file and with the package lock file and the Webpack config file. Now, if we go into and edit the package.json file and in the scripts object, We just add a line with the command build, which will alias to the Webpack CLI command. And then if we go back to our console, just enter the npm run build. Now, even though there isn't anything yet in our index.js file for Webpack to build, by default, it'll still run with it and output a default main.js file in the dist folder. Now, at this point, we can go into the Webpack config file and start putting in some basic components. And it starts off with a module.exports object, and it needs to have a couple properties. The first one is the entry point. This entry point can be a string, an object, or a function. Here, for just basic purposes, I just put in our source index.js file in a string. But you can, as I said, you can add an object with multiple entry points, or even more advanced stuff, you can have a function that outputs either a string or a object, depending on your needs. The next is going to be the output attribute or element that it's going to have basically a file name as well as the path. The path, oddly enough, has to have this path.resolve, because for some reason, Node has to have an absolute path rather than just the local path on the output. Then in the package.json, we can now explicitly call the Webpack config. We can change, instead of the build Webpack, it's Webpack --config, Webpack config.js. And if you want to have multiple build scripts, you can list them all here with different options and different config files. And now, because we changed the file name on the output as app.js, instead of the main, in the dist folder, it'll output app.js instead of the main.js. Is kind of basic. And here we're going to cover what is really Webpack's core functionality. Now, in the past, if you had multiple JavaScript files and libraries, it wasn't uncommon to see a long list of script tags such as this. Not only is this an eyesore from a coding standpoint, it slows down your page load time due to excessive HTTP requests, and it's functionally precarious as some of these libraries depend on other libraries, and we slowly descend into dependency hell. Webpack leverages the use of ES6 modules so that we can import libraries and require modules, resulting in cleaner, more maintainable, and reusable code. Each individual component depends on importing its own dependencies and exporting what it wants to make public for other modules. In this little example here, in the source folder, I created another JS folder with a foo.js and lib.js. And in the index.js, I created an import moment from moment. That's the moment library that I imported, that I downloaded earlier through npm. We'll just automatically pull that in. Webpack will automatically pull that in, and then you can start working with that library straight away. Also, in the foo.js, created a module.exports, a little object there that the index.js can now pull in using require, and it can access that. Now, up to this point, I focused on how Webpack handles JavaScript, because it's important to note that Webpack essentially treats everything as JavaScript, even your HTML and CSS. Now, Webpack handles JavaScript dependencies, but it also handles all other dependencies such as CSS and other file types through the use of loaders. Now, in this example, we've added a style.css file to our source folder. And in our Webpack config, we add a module with a rule that uses a regex test to target any CSS file. And then it uses the CSS loader to interpret the import style.css directive we've added to the index.js. And then the style loader is responsible for injecting those styles into the DOM using a style tag. Now, for those like me who value separation of concerns, this took me a little while to wrap my head around. I'm still a little uneasy about the whole CSS in JS concept. Fortunately, Webpack does provide us with some other options. I'm going to move into plugins, are like loaders, but with some additional superpowers. This is where Webpack can really start getting complex and sticky, as there are many, many plugins, and connecting them all and chaining them all together can really get to be a chore if you don't have a clear idea of what your build needs are. So I'm just going to touch on these first three. First is the HTML Webpack plugin. It takes the job over of creating the HTML file and putting it into the dist folder along with compiled and processed CSS and JS files. In the plugins, first you do the const that requires the HTML plugin. Then in the plugins list in module, you have the options of the title, template, and file name. The title is just basically a variable that you can now reference in your HTML file, either in the head or in an H1 tag, and that will when Webpack builds it out, it will insert that. So you can have a whole list of variables that you can use, and if you look over in the files, I've added an index.html file in the source folder, and that will use that as the template file. And so basically, it has its own kind of built-in templating arrangement. So while you can use other templating engines like Nunjucks or Handlebars or whatever, it already has some basic functionality in there. And then the file name, of course, is the file it will actually output to the dist file, or the dist folder. Next, the mini CSS extract plugin. That extracts the CSS into a separate file or files so that you don't have to rely on JavaScript loading your CSS, and thus we have our separation concerns preserved. The last one I want to reference is just the Clean Webpack plugin. It's a very simple plugin, but it can be used to clear the dist folder before creating any output, so you don't leave files around when you change the name of your output file. Part of me wishes I could take more time to go on a deep dive with some of Webpack's features, such as file loader and the Webpack dev server. Very useful tool for rapid web development. But if I go on too much longer, I'm going to kind of violate the premise of this presentation. Am I getting too complex? But I am going to touch on this one little useful feature that's built into Webpack. Webpack can automatically rebuild a bundle when a change in your app happens in real time, and it'll keep listening for the next change. We can do that by adding another script to the package.json file and running npm run watch from the console. One nice feature of the watch mode is that the bundle is only changed if there are no build errors. If there are errors, watch will keep listening for changes and try to rebuild the bundle, but the current working bundle is not affected by those problematic builds. I personally have found that very useful, as other bundlers and task runners that I've worked with will sometimes just quit or crap out if they hit an error. So I'm just going to kind of circle back around to the quote I showed earlier, that the only simplicity to be trusted is the simplicity to be found on the far side of complexity. There's another quote that I read in an article actually just this week, that simplicity is ironically one of the most difficult things to do well. Usually the more effortless something appears, the more effort it took. I know I haven't covered Webpack in depth, but that really wasn't my intention. I wanted to show that if you look at it piece by piece, it's not so monumentally scary as it first appears. And Webpack development, or web development, is complex, but it's really only as complex as we let it be. And if any of you are interested in learning Webpack a bit more in depth, there's a Learn Webpack course available for free on YouTube. It's a 10-part course that lasts a little over 90 minutes or so. It's fairly recent and up to date, and the gentleman who presented it is named Colt Steele, though I suspect that's actually a pseudonym of some sort. If not, he has a really cool name. And I highly recommend it for anyone wanting to get to know Webpack better. And I just want to say thank you, and if any of you want to contact me or connect with me, I'm available